Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit, American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on the amnesia and the anemia of secular humanism. A secular humanist envisions a society in which all vestiges of ancient superstition have been utterly eradicated. And by ancient superstition, of course, what the secular humanist means is religion. Religion in all of its personal and institutional trappings. The secular humanist longs for the day in which human beings have broken free of the fetters of irrational faith and irrational belief in God and irrational assumption that the values by which we live have a transcendent foundation to them. Charles Taylor describes the secular humanist worldview quite accurately, I think, as one that is a subtractive narrative. And by that, what Taylor means is that the secular humanist worldview is primarily one in which ideas and concepts and values and customs and worldview pillars have been yanked out or subtracted because the secular humanist disagrees with them. And of course, all of those things which have been subtracted are the inheritance from 2,000 years of Christian thinking. And what you have left over is the worldview that the secular humanist endorses, the rather flat materialistic worldview in which there is no God, in which science is the only proper way of understanding reality, and in which all values are human-made, originate with humans. And as a consequence of this subtractive narrative, Charles Taylor says that modern human beings possess what he calls a buffered self. The buffered self is a self that has been insulated by a secular culture from the sense of the transcendent, such that if the transcendent ever manages to break through the buffer that protects the self, it is likely to be dismissed as delusion or a fanciful flight of imagination, or worse. I think that Charles Taylor is quite right about both of those claims. I'd like to add two more to his criticism of secular humanism. I'd like to argue that secular humanism suffers from an amnesia, and that this amnesia in turn begets an anemia, a poverty, a cultural and spiritual poverty. So let me say a few words about the amnesia of secular humanism first. I take my leaf here from the late 19th and early 20th century British journalist and Catholic G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton once argued that secular humanism lives off of the capital of Christianity. And this is what he meant. Secular humanists basically argue that human beings possess inherent dignity, and that as a consequence you don't need a God to somehow infuse value into human beings or anything else for that matter. But in a materialistic worldview, it's difficult to understand where an inherent value, such as dignity, might come from. Materialism gives rise to no moral values. Materialism doesn't establish dignity. As a consequence, it seems that the claim that human beings possess inherent dignity or inherent value is one that's merely stipulated by secular humanists. It has no foundation. And G.K. Chesterton argues that because it seems to be so out of place in a secular humanistic worldview, it must be a unwitting holdover from the very Christian ethos which secular humanists reject. They have forgotten where one of the primary staples of their worldview, the inherent dignity and value of human beings, comes from. And they've forgotten it because they have subtracted the Christian ethos from their way of looking at the world. So to claim that any value in a secular humanist worldview has foundation of some kind that can be enduring and solid is just false. It is living off of the capital of Christianity, and that capital for the secular humanist simply is not enough to firmly found values. Like all capital, once it's spent, it's spent. And this amnesia, this forgetfulness of where one of the primary value claims of secular humanism actually comes from, gives rise in turn to an anemia, a rather pernicious anemia, it seems to me. And I've already hinted at it when I said that the amnesia offers values that have no foundation. Because there is no foundation other than human stipulation for values, such as the inherent dignity of human beings, which in turn would elicit proper responses such as love and compassion, tolerance and patience, fairness and justice. Because there is no foundation for these values, they can be embraced or they can be rejected at the whim of either individuals or cultures. There's no imperative to them. Oh, I know that secular humanists try to infuse some gravitas into their talk about inherent dignity of humans by appealing to something called, for example, natural rights. But it's not at all clear what natural rights are in a worldview that is stripped of a transcendent dimension, because traditionally natural rights originate with the moral order established by a God, by a transcendent dimension. And a secular humanist, of course, has to reject that. G.K. Chesterton argues that in this kind of a worldview that is bereft of any transcendent dimension, values become little more than moods. They can come, they can go. They can be embraced in a kind of sentimental, shallow way, or they can be seized in a kind of zealous, intolerant way. But at any rate, they lack foundation and hence are liable to a chameleon-like oscillation depending upon the time, the place, the culture. So I would argue, my friends, that the buffered self, which is born by the subtractive narrative of secular humanism, suffers from an amnesia of where the values of secular humanism really come from, which in turn gives rise to a spiritual and cultural and moral poverty or anemia, which is not at all conducive to the flourishing of either the individual or the culture. Secular humanism is in its intentions and in its ideals perhaps noble, but it is ultimately a grand and tragic failure. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you for listening.